President Biden's recent announcement on marijuana policy has been touted as a historic step forward. However, beneath the surface of this supposed progress lies a deeply flawed approach. Rescheduling marijuana, while a move in the right direction, falls drastically short of the comprehensive reform needed to address the decades of harm inflicted by the war on drugs. This half measure fails to rectify the injustices faced by marginalized communities, particularly communities of color, who have borne the brunt of marijuana prohibition. True justice demands nothing less than full legalization and a commitment to dismantling the systems of oppression that have fueled mass incarceration and perpetuated racial disparities. The Biden administration's decision to initiate a review of marijuana's classification under the Controlled Substances Act is a long overdue acknowledgement of the failures of current drug policy. However, the limited scope of this action, focusing solely on rescheduling, reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of the issue at hand. Rescheduling marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 would merely reclassify it as a drug with a lower potential for abuse. While this might seem like a significant shift, it fails to address the underlying problem: the criminalization of a substance that is demonstrably less harmful than alcohol or tobacco. Moreover, rescheduling marijuana does not erase the stigma associated with its use. It does not undo the countless lives that have been destroyed by convictions for nonviolent drug offenses. It does not address the systemic racism embedded within the criminal justice system that has disproportionately targeted Black and brown communities for marijuana-related arrests and incarceration. The legacy of the war on drugs is deeply intertwined with racial injustice, and any attempt to reform marijuana policy must confront this reality head-on. The Biden administration's approach to marijuana reform feels like a hesitant step forward, a cautious dip into the waters of change while clinging to the remnants of a failed and harmful policy. This hesitancy is unacceptable. The time for incrementalism is over. We need bold action, rooted in principles of justice and equity, to dismantle the structures of oppression that have fueled the war on drugs and its devastating consequences. Rescheduling marijuana is often presented as a compromise, a middle ground between prohibition and legalization. However, this framing obscures the fundamental inadequacy of such a measure. The distinction between rescheduling and descheduling is crucial to understanding why rescheduling alone is insufficient. Rescheduling simply shifts marijuana to a different category within the existing drug classification system, while descheduling would remove it entirely from this framework, effectively ending federal prohibition. The continued classification of marijuana as a controlled substance, even under a less restrictive schedule, perpetuates the harmful narrative that it is a dangerous drug. This narrative has been used to justify decades of discriminatory law enforcement practices, leading to mass incarceration and the disenfranchisement of countless individuals, particularly people of color. Rescheduling does nothing to challenge this narrative or to address the systemic racism that underpins it. Furthermore, rescheduling fails to address the economic barriers to entry that have prevented many individuals and communities from participating in the legal marijuana industry. Under a rescheduling scenario, marijuana businesses would still face significant obstacles in accessing banking services, obtaining loans, and navigating complex regulatory hurdles. These barriers disproportionately impact entrepreneurs from marginalized communities, who often lack the resources and connections to overcome them. Rescheduling marijuana is akin to placing a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. It might offer a temporary illusion of progress, but it does nothing to address the underlying injury or to prevent further harm. True justice requires a more radical approach, one that dismantles the systems of oppression that have been built upon the foundation of marijuana prohibition. Even under a rescheduling scenario, individuals and communities would remain ensnared in a complex web of criminal regulations. The continued criminalization of marijuana, even at a lower level, perpetuates the harmful cycle of arrest, prosecution, and incarceration that has devastated countless lives. The collateral consequences of marijuana convictions, such as the loss of voting rights, employment opportunities, and access to public housing, would continue to disproportionately impact people of color, perpetuating cycles of poverty and inequality. The persistence of criminal penalties for marijuana-related offenses, even under a rescheduling framework, creates a climate of fear and uncertainty. Individuals would still be subject to arrest and prosecution for possession of small amounts of marijuana, even for personal use. This would particularly impact communities of color, who are already disproportionately targeted by law enforcement. The threat of arrest and incarceration would continue to cast a shadow over the lives of millions of Americans, undermining their sense of security and their ability to fully participate in society. Moreover, the continued existence of criminal regulations surrounding marijuana would hinder the development of a robust and equitable legal industry. The fear of legal repercussions would discourage investment and innovation, stifling economic growth and job creation. The patchwork of state and local laws, often conflicting and confusing, would create a regulatory nightmare for businesses, particularly small businesses and those owned by people of color. Rescheduling marijuana, while presented as a step towards reform, would ultimately leave individuals and communities trapped in a system that perpetuates harm and injustice. The only way to truly break free from this cycle is through full legalization, coupled with comprehensive social and economic reforms that address the legacy of the war on drugs and its devastating impact on marginalized communities. The Biden administration's emphasis on rescheduling marijuana as a significant policy shift creates a dangerous illusion of progress. While it might appear as a step in the right direction, it ultimately serves to maintain the status quo, perpetuating the very disparities that the war on drugs has created and exacerbated. This illusion of progress is particularly pernicious because it diverts attention from the urgent need for more transformative solutions. By framing rescheduling as a major concession, the administration risks undermining public support for full legalization. It creates the false impression that meaningful action is being taken, when in reality, the underlying structures of injustice remain firmly in place. This strategy allows the administration to appease moderate voices calling for reform while avoiding the more contentious issue of full legalization. However, this approach comes at a steep cost, sacrificing the pursuit of true justice for the sake of political expediency. The illusion of progress created by rescheduling also serves to legitimize the existing system of drug control. By maintaining marijuana as a controlled substance, even under a less restrictive schedule, the administration implicitly endorses the flawed premise that the government has the right to dictate what substances individuals can and cannot consume. This reinforces the notion that the war on drugs, despite its well-documented failures, is fundamentally legitimate, and that its harms can be mitigated through minor adjustments rather than fundamental change. The Biden administration's focus on rescheduling marijuana risks perpetuating the illusion of progress, diverting attention from the need for more transformative solutions, and ultimately maintaining the very disparities that the war on drugs has created and exacerbated. Descheduling marijuana is not merely a policy choice, it is a moral imperative. It represents a recognition of the profound harm inflicted by decades of prohibition and a commitment to rectifying the injustices faced by countless individuals and communities. Descheduling would remove marijuana entirely from the Controlled Substances Act, effectively ending federal prohibition and acknowledging the fundamental right of adults to consume a substance that is demonstrably less harmful than alcohol or tobacco. Descheduling marijuana is essential to dismantling the system of mass criminalization that has disproportionately targeted communities of color. By removing the threat of arrest and incarceration for marijuana-related offenses, we can begin to heal the wounds inflicted by the war on drugs and create a more just and equitable society. The legacy of this failed policy continues to cast a long shadow over marginalized communities, perpetuating cycles of poverty, incarceration, and despair. Moreover, descheduling would unleash the economic potential of the legal marijuana industry, creating jobs, generating tax revenue, and stimulating economic growth. The current patchwork of state and local laws, often conflicting and confusing, has stifled innovation and prevented the industry from reaching its full potential. Descheduling would create a more stable and predictable regulatory environment, encouraging investment and fostering the creation of new businesses and industries. Descheduling marijuana is not just about righting the wrongs of the past, it is about building a more just and equitable future. It is about creating a society where individuals are free to make their own choices, where communities are no longer torn apart by discriminatory law enforcement practices, and where the economic benefits of legalization are shared by all. The continued federal prohibition of marijuana stands in stark contrast to the growing acceptance of its medicinal and recreational use across the country. This hypocrisy is particularly evident in light of the opioid epidemic, a public health crisis fueled in part by the overprescription of highly addictive painkillers. While millions of Americans suffer from chronic pain, the federal government continues to obstruct access to a safe and effective alternative medical marijuana. The federal government's stance on marijuana is not only hypocritical but also counterproductive. By clinging to outdated policies, the government is missing out on a valuable opportunity to generate tax revenue, create jobs, and promote public health. The legal marijuana industry is booming in states that have chosen to regulate and tax it, generating billions of dollars in revenue that could be used to fund essential public services. Furthermore, the federal government's prohibitionist approach has done little to curb the supply of marijuana. In fact, it has created a thriving black market, enriching criminal organizations and fueling violence. By contrast, legalization and regulation would allow law enforcement to focus on more serious crimes, while ensuring that marijuana is produced and sold safely and responsibly. The federal government's continued prohibition of marijuana is untenable both morally and practically. It is time for the federal government to catch up with the will of the people and the realities of the 21st century. Descheduling marijuana is not only the right thing to do, it is the smart thing to do. The legalization of marijuana presents a unique opportunity to address both economic and moral imperatives facing our nation. From the perspective of economic justice, legalization promises to generate significant tax revenue, create countless jobs, and stimulate economic growth, particularly in communities hit hardest by the war on drugs. These economic benefits cannot be overstated, particularly in a time of growing income inequality and economic uncertainty. The moral imperative for legalization is rooted in the fundamental principles of individual liberty and bodily autonomy. The government's role is to protect its citizens, not to dictate their personal choices, particularly when it comes to a substance that is demonstrably less harmful than alcohol or tobacco. Prohibition has failed to prevent marijuana use and has only served to create a vast criminal black market, enriching criminal organizations and fueling violence. Moreover, the war on drugs has had a devastating impact on communities of color, leading to mass incarceration, the separation of families, and the disenfranchisement of millions of Americans. Legalization presents an opportunity to begin to heal the wounds of the past and to create a more just and equitable society where all individuals have an equal opportunity to succeed. The legalization of marijuana is not simply a policy debate, it is a moral and economic imperative that demands our attention. By embracing legalization, we can create a more just, equitable, and prosperous society for all Americans. The economic potential of a legalized marijuana industry is undeniable. From job creation to tax revenue generation, the benefits are substantial and far-reaching. Legalization would create countless jobs across a variety of sectors, from cultivation and processing to retail and tourism. These jobs would provide much-needed economic opportunities, particularly in communities hit hardest by the war on drugs and suffering from high unemployment rates. The tax revenue generated from a legal marijuana industry could be transformative, providing funding for essential public services such as education, healthcare, and infrastructure. This revenue could also be used to invest in drug treatment and prevention programs, addressing the root causes of substance abuse and creating a healthier society. The potential economic benefits of legalization are vast and could provide a much-needed boost to local, state, and national economies. Legalization would also allow for the development of a regulated market, ensuring consumer safety and product quality. This would eliminate the risks associated with the black market, where products are often contaminated or mislabeled. A regulated market would also generate valuable data on marijuana use, allowing for more informed public health policies and evidence-based interventions. By unleashing the economic potential of the marijuana industry, we can create jobs, generate tax revenue, and stimulate economic growth, all while promoting public health and safety. The economic benefits of legalization are clear and compelling, making it a sound investment in our collective future. Legalizing marijuana is not just about economic benefits, it is about social justice. It is about rectifying the harms caused by decades of discriminatory drug policies that have disproportionately targeted communities of color. The war on drugs has been a war on communities, leading to mass incarceration, the separation of families, and the perpetuation of poverty and inequality. Legalization presents an opportunity to begin to heal the wounds of the past by expunging the records of those convicted of non-violent marijuana offenses. It is about restoring voting rights, expanding access to housing and employment opportunities, and creating a more equitable playing field for all Americans. Moreover, legalization can be a catalyst for broader criminal justice reform. By redirecting law enforcement resources away from nonviolent drug offenses, we can focus on addressing more serious crimes and creating safer communities. The revenue generated from a legal marijuana industry can be reinvested in communities most impacted by the war on drugs, funding programs that promote education, job training, and economic development. Legalizing marijuana is not a panacea for all of the challenges facing communities of color, but it is a crucial step towards creating a more just and equitable society. It is about acknowledging the harms of the past, taking responsibility for our collective actions, and working together to build a better future for all. While descheduling marijuana is a necessary step towards justice, it is not sufficient on its own. True reform requires a comprehensive approach that addresses the multifaceted harms of the war on drugs and its enduring legacy. This includes investing in drug treatment and prevention programs, expanding access to mental health services, and addressing the root causes of substance abuse, such as poverty, trauma, and lack of opportunity. Comprehensive reform also necessitates a fundamental shift in our approach to drug policy, moving away from a punitive model focused on criminalization and towards a public health model that prioritizes treatment, harm reduction, and prevention. This shift requires a rejection of the racist and discriminatory policies that have fueled mass incarceration and perpetuated cycles of poverty and inequality. Furthermore, comprehensive reform must include measures to address the collateral consequences of marijuana convictions, such as the loss of voting rights, employment opportunities, and access to public housing. This requires a commitment to restorative justice, providing individuals with the resources and support they need to rebuild their lives and reintegrate into society. The need for comprehensive reform is urgent. The war on drugs has devastated countless lives and communities, leaving behind a legacy of trauma, injustice, and despair. It is time to chart a new path forward, one grounded in principles of justice, equity, and compassion. The time for incrementalism is over. The Biden administration's focus on rescheduling marijuana, while presented as a step forward, is a deeply inadequate response to the harms inflicted by decades of prohibition. True justice demands nothing less than full legalization, coupled with comprehensive social and economic reforms that address the legacy of the war on drugs and its devastating impact on marginalized communities. We must demand more from our elected officials. We must hold them accountable for their promises of change and their commitment to justice. The fight for marijuana legalization is not just about a plant, it is about fundamental human rights, racial justice, and economic equity. It is about creating a society where all individuals have the opportunity to reach their full potential, free from the shackles of outdated and discriminatory policies. The movement for marijuana justice is gaining momentum across the country. From coast to coast, individuals and organizations are organizing, mobilizing, and demanding change. We must seize this moment, raise our voices in unison, and demand that our elected officials enact meaningful and transformative reforms. The time for justice is now. Let us work together to create a future free from the failed policies of the past, a future where marijuana prohibition is relegated to the dustbin of history and where all individuals are treated with dignity, respect, and compassion. Imagine a future where marijuana prohibition is a distant memory, a relic of a bygone era marked by injustice and oppression. Imagine a society where individuals are free to make their own choices, where communities are no longer torn apart by discriminatory law enforcement practices, and where the economic benefits of legalization are shared by all. This is the future we must strive to create. The path forward is clear. We must continue to push for full legalization at both the state and federal levels, dismantling the legal architecture of prohibition and rejecting the failed policies of the past. We must demand that our elected officials prioritize criminal justice reform, investing in communities most impacted by the war on drugs, and creating a more just and equitable society. This is not just a fight for marijuana legalization, It is a fight for a more just and equitable future for all. It is a fight for individual liberty, for racial justice, and for economic opportunity. It is a fight for a society that values compassion over punishment, rehabilitation over incarceration, and hope over despair. Let us embrace this vision of a future free from marijuana prohibition and work tirelessly to make it a reality. The time for change is now. Let us seize this moment and create a world where all individuals are free to thrive, regardless of their race, ethnicity, or socioeconomic status. Let us build a future where marijuana is no longer a source of division and injustice, but rather a symbol of progress, healing, and hope.